Everyone knew the Duke of Pembroke as the Ice King of London, a man who hadn't smiled since his fiancée vanished into the night 5 years ago, taking his heart and his trust with her. He was ruthless, wealthy, and utterly alone. But on a freezing Christmas Eve in 1892, his world shattered in a single heartbeat. A shivering 5-year-old girl tugged on his velvet coat and whispered, "Please help my mama. She won't wake up." When the Duke looked up to see the woman slumped in the snow, the blood drained from his face. It wasn't just a beggar. It was the woman he had sworn to hate forever, and the little girl holding his hand. She had his eyes. This is the story of a betrayal that wasn't what it seemed, and a love that refused to die. London, December 24th, 1892. The fog in London didn't just sit on the city, it choked it. It was a thick pea soup yellow that tasted of coal smoke and the Thames, swirling around the gas lamps of Mayfair like a living thing. Arthur Pembroke, the 8th Duke of Ashford, stepped out of the Royal Opera House, his expression harder than the cobblestones beneath his polished boots. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with sharp features that seemed carved from granite. At 32, he possessed a fortune that could buy half of England, yet the society pages whispered that he was emotionally bankrupt. They called him the Iron Duke. He hadn't attended a ball or a dinner party in 5 years, not since the scandal of 1887. "Your carriage is ready, Your Grace," his footman Thomas said, bowing low, his breath clouding in the freezing air. Arthur nodded curtly, adjusting his gloves. He hated Christmas. It was a reminder of warmth he didn't feel and a family he didn't have. He moved towards the black carriage emblazoned with the Pembroke crest, eager to return to the silence of his study and a glass of scotch. He had one foot on the carriage step when he felt a tug. It was faint at first, like a ghost brushing against him. He ignored it. Then it came again, stronger, a desperate yank on the heavy wool of his overcoat. Arthur stopped and looked down. Standing there, shivering so violently her teeth chattered audibly, was a child. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She wore a ragged grey dress that was meant for summer, layered with a man's tattered vest that swallowed her small frame. Her feet were wrapped in burlap sacks, soaked through with the slush of the street. "Please, sir," the girl squeaked, her voice trembling. "Please help my mama. She fell down. She won't get up." Arthur's instinct was to reach for a coin. He wasn't cruel, just indifferent. He reached into his pocket to retrieve a sovereign, intending to press it into the child's hand and signal Thomas to deal with it. "Where is she?" Arthur asked, his voice deep and detached. "There." The girl pointed a shaking finger toward the alleyway beside the opera house, where the shadows were deepest. "By the wall. The bad man pushed her." The bad man? The phrase pricked Arthur's attention. He looked at the girl again. Under the smudge of soot on her cheek, her skin was pale porcelain. But it was her eyes that made him freeze. They were heterochromatic, one a piercing blue, the other a flecked hazel. Arthur's heart slammed against his ribs. He had those eyes. His grandfather had those eyes. It was a genetic quirk of the Pembroke line, rare and unmistakable. He stared at the child, the coin forgotten in his hand. "What is your name, child?" "Rose," she whispered. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. He turned abruptly, his long coat swirling around his ankles, and marched towards the alleyway. Thomas, the footman, scrambled to follow with the lantern. "Your Grace, is everything all right?" Arthur didn't answer. He walked into the gloom. The alley smelled of refuse and stale gin. Near a stack of discarded crates, a figure lay crumpled in the snow. It was a woman, her dark hair splayed out like a fan, collecting snowflakes. She wore a threadbare shawl, her body thin and frail. Thomas raised the lantern, casting a pool of yellow light over the woman's face. Arthur stopped dead. The world tilted on its axis. The noise of the street, the horses, the carolers, the wind, fell silent. All he could hear was the rushing of blood in his ears. He knew that face. even gaunt with hunger, even bruised on the cheekbone, even aged by 5 years of what looked like hell on earth. He knew her. "Lydia," he breathed, the name scraping his throat like broken glass. Lydia Hawthorne, the daughter of a country vicar, the woman he had intended to make his duchess, the woman who had vanished 3 days before their wedding, along with the Pembroke sapphire and a letter claiming she never loved him. Only his title. He had spent 5 years hating her. He had burned her letters. He had forbidden her name to be spoken in his house. And now here she was, dying in an alleyway, a stone's throw from where he sat in a velvet box, watching an opera. "Mamma!" Rose cried out, rushing past Arthur to fall onto the woman's chest. "Mamma, the tall man is here! Wake up!" Lydia didn't stir. Her lips were blue. Arthur stood paralyzed, a war raging inside him. The memory of her betrayal was a hot coal in his chest, but the sight of her, broken and lifeless, overwhelmed it. And the child. "Rose, Your Grace," Thomas whispered, recognizing the woman. The shock on the footman's face mirrored Arthur's own. Is that Miss Lydia?" Arthur looked at the child weeping over her mother's body. He looked at the woman who had destroyed him. "Get the carriage," Arthur commanded, his voice unrecognizable. "Sir? Bring the carriage around, now!" Arthur roared, the sound echoing off the brick walls. He dropped to his knees in the slush, ruining his bespoke trousers. He didn't care. He reached out and touched Lydia's face. It was ice cold. "Lydia," he growled, shaking her shoulders. "Open your eyes. Damn you, open your eyes." Her eyelids fluttered. A sliver of cognac-colored eyes appeared, unfocused and glassy. She looked at him, and for a moment, confusion clouded her gaze. Then, recognition. She didn't smile. She flinched. She tried to scramble back, pushing herself against the wet brick wall, gasping for air. "No," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "No, please, not you. He'll kill you." "Who?" Arthur demanded, gripping her arms to steady her. "Who will kill me?" "Arthur," she sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. "Run! You have to. Take Rose and run." Then her eyes rolled back and she went limp in his arms. Arthur scooped her up. She was terrifyingly light, nothing but bird bones and rags. He stood up, clutching her against his chest, shielding her from the wind. "Come with me," he said to the little girl, Rose, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Are you taking Mamma to jail?" Rose asked, her lip trembling. Arthur looked down at the child with his eyes. "No," he said grimly. "I'm taking her home." The ride to Pembroke Manor was suffocatingly silent. Lydia lay unconscious on the velvet bench seat, covered by Arthur's heavy coat and a fur blanket Thomas had retrieved from the boot. Rose sat opposite her mother, her small legs swinging, clutching a stale bread roll Thomas had found in his pocket. She watched Arthur with the wariness of a stray cat. Arthur watched them both. His mind was a chaotic storm. 5 years. He had hired detectives. He had scoured the continent. The Pinkertons had told him she had boarded a ship to America with a lover. They said she was living in luxury in New York. They said she had pawned the sapphire to buy a townhouse in Manhattan. Arthur looked at Lydia's hands. They were rough, red, and cracked from hard labor. Her fingernails were broken. This was not the hand of a woman living in luxury. This was the hand of a woman who scrubbed floors. And the child. "How old are you, Rose?" Arthur asked, breaking the silence. His voice was softer now, but still commanded attention. Rose stopped chewing. She swallowed hard. "I'm 5, sir. I'll be 6 in the spring." Arthur did the mental math instantly. 5 years and 6 months ago, Lydia had left. If she was pregnant when she left? He closed his eyes, a headache blooming behind his temples. If Rose was his, Lydia had stolen his child. She had denied him his heir. The betrayal deepened, twisting in his gut like a knife. "What is your last name?" "Just Rose," she said simply. "And your father?" Arthur pressed, watching her closely. "Mama says Papa is a prince," Rose said, her eyes lighting up slightly. "He lives in a castle far away." But we couldn't go to him because the bad man was watching. The bad man, Arthur repeated. Who is he? Rose shrank back into the seat. I'm not allowed to say his name. Mamma says if we say his name, he finds us. The carriage slowed as it turned into the gravel drive of Pembroke Manor. The massive iron gate swung open, and the grand estate loomed in the darkness, windows glowing like eyes. When the carriage halted, the household staff was already waiting, alerted by a runner Thomas had sent ahead. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, stood at the top of the stairs, flanked by 2 maids. Arthur stepped out carrying Lydia. A collective gasp went through the staff. Mrs. Gable brought a hand to her mouth. They all remembered Lydia. They had loved her. She had been kind to them, unlike the cold socialites Arthur usually courted. "Prepare the blue room," Arthur barked, striding past them into the grand foyer, "and send for Dr. Warren. Tell him it is a matter of life and death." "The blue room, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable stammered, hurrying after him. "But that was her room." "Did I stutter?" Arthur snapped. He carried Lydia up the sweeping staircase, the mud from his boots staining the pristine carpet. He laid her gently on the massive 4-poster bed. In the soft light of the chandelier, she looked even worse. Her collarbones protruded sharply. A jagged scar ran along her hairline, hidden by her matted hair. Rose stood in the doorway, clutching the doorframe, looking tiny in the massive hallway. "Come here, Rose," Arthur said. She tiptoed into the room. "Mrs. Gable," Arthur said without turning around, "take the child, bathe her, feed her warm soup. Find her something to wear that isn't this." "No!" Rose shrieked, darting forward and grabbing Lydia's limp hand. "I won't leave Mama. You'll hurt her." Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her face softening. "Oh, you poor little lamb. No one is going to hurt your Mama. The Duke is going to make her better." "He looks angry," Rose whispered loudly, glaring at Arthur. Arthur stiffened. "I am not angry at her," he lied. "Go with Mrs. Gable. You can see your mother as soon as the doctor has been." Reluctantly, Rose let go of Lydia's hand. As she walked away with the housekeeper, she looked back at Arthur. "You promise?" "I keep my promises," Arthur said. "Unlike your mother," he thought bitterly. Once the door clicked shut, Arthur was alone with Lydia. The room was cold. The fire hadn't been lit in years. He walked over to the fireplace and struck a match, watching the flames lick at the dry logs. He turned back to the bed. He shouldn't be here. He should turn her over to the authorities. She was a thief. She was a liar. He walked to the bedside and looked down at her. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Why, Lydia?" he whispered into the silence. "Why did you run? And why in God's name did you come back like this?" As if in answer, Lydia groaned. She thrashed slightly, her brow furrowing in a nightmare. Don't tell Arthur," she mumbled, delirious. "He can't know. Lord Frederick, he has the letter. He'll kill him." Arthur froze. Lord Frederick. Lord Frederick was Arthur's cousin, the man who stood to inherit the dukedom if Arthur died without an heir, the man who had been Arthur's closest confidant after Lydia left, the one who had poured the drinks and fueled Arthur's rage against her. Arthur leaned closer. "What about Frederick, Lydia?" "He made me," she whimpered, tears leaking from her closed eyes. "To save Arthur. I had to leave. The poison." The door burst open. Dr. Warren bustled in, followed by 2 maids carrying basins of hot water. "Your Grace," the doctor said, breathless. "I came as fast as I could." Arthur straightened up, his face masking the shock of what he had just heard. He stepped back into the shadows of the room. "Fix her, Warren," Arthur commanded, his voice cold steel. "Do whatever it takes, because she has a great deal of explaining to do." He walked to the window and looked out at the snowy grounds. "He made me leave to save Arthur." If what she said in her delirium was true, then the last 5 years of Arthur's life had been a lie engineered by his own blood. And if Frederick was involved, then Lydia hadn't just returned to a former lover. She had walked back into the lion's den. Arthur looked at his reflection in the glass. The Ice King was melting, and underneath, a burning rage was beginning to take form. He needed to know the truth, and if his cousin had touched a hair on her head, Arthur would burn London to the ground to make him pay. For 3 days, the master of Pembroke Manor did not sleep. Arthur paced the length of the hallway outside the blue room, a sentinel in a silk dressing gown. Inside, Lydia fought a raging fever. Dr. Warren had been grim. Pneumonia, he had said, wiping his spectacles, and exhaustion. Her body has nothing left to give, Your Grace. It is as if she has been running a marathon for 5 years without stopping for breath. Arthur had dismissed the staff, sitting by her bedside himself during the darkest hours of the night. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, terrified that each breath would be her last. Every time he looked at her, the anger that had sustained him for half a decade crumbled a little more, replaced by a gnawing, icy dread. He made me leave. The poison. Her fevered words replayed in his mind on an endless loop. On the morning of the 4th day, Arthur retreated to his study to review the estate ledgers, a futile attempt to distract himself. He was interrupted by a knock. "Come," he growled. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Mrs. Gable stepped in, holding the hand of the little girl, Rose. Rose looked transformed. The rags were gone, replaced by a soft woolen dress of deep navy, likely altered from one of the village children's clothes. Her hair was washed and brushed into shiny dark curls, tied back with a ribbon. But her eyes, those mismatched Pembroke eyes, were filled with suspicion. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, bowing. "But the child, Rose, she refuses to eat her porridge unless she sees you. She is convinced you have thrown her mother into a dungeon." Arthur sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Leave us, Mrs. Gable." The housekeeper hesitated, then nodded and withdrew, closing the door. Arthur looked at the girl. She stood near the door, hands balled into fists at her sides. She was small, but she had a defiance that reminded him painfully of himself. "I do not have a dungeon," Arthur said flatly. "Your mother is in a bed. She is very sick, and the doctor says she needs quiet." "Is she going to die?" Rose asked. Her voice didn't tremble. It was the flat, pragmatic tone of a child who had seen too much death already. Arthur stood up and walked around his massive mahogany desk. He knelt on one knee, so he was eye level with her. "No, I have the best doctors in London. She will not die on my watch." Rose studied his face, searching for a lie. Finding none, she relaxed slightly. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out something small and wrapped in a scrap of dirty linen. "Mamma told me to keep this safe," Rose whispered, stepping closer. "She said if the bad man caught us, I was to swallow it. But it's too big to swallow." Arthur held out his hand. Rose placed the object in his palm. He unwrapped the linen. Inside lay a ring. Arthur's breath hitched. It wasn't the Pembroke sapphire. It was a simple silver band, twisted into the shape of a vine. It was worth perhaps 5 shillings. He remembered the day he gave it to her. It was before he was the Duke, before the weight of the title crushed him. They were walking in the gardens of her father's vicarage. He had bought it at a village fair. She had worn it on a chain around her neck, hidden under her dress, even after he gave her the massive diamond engagement ring. "This is the one that matters," she had told him. "This is the one from Arthur, not the Duke." She had kept it. Through poverty, through starvation, she had kept this worthless piece of silver instead of selling it for food. "Why?" Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "Why did she keep this?" "She said it was magic," Rose explained solemnly. "She said it belonged to the only man she ever loved." She said looking at it made her brave. Arthur closed his hand around the ring, the sharp edges digging into his palm. The narrative he had built, the story of the gold-digging harlot, was dissolving like sugar in hot tea. Suddenly the sound of carriage wheels crunching on the gravel drive outside shattered the moment. Arthur stood up and moved to the window. A sleek black carriage had pulled up. A man stepped out, dressed in the height of fashion, tapping a cane with a silver wolf's head handle against his boot. Arthur's blood ran cold. Lord Frederick Pembroke. "Rose," Arthur said, his voice low and urgent. "Listen to me carefully. You must hide." Rose's eyes went wide. "Is it him? Is it the smiling man?" "The smiling man. A fitting name for a snake." "Yes," Arthur said. "Go to Mrs. Gable. Tell her to take you to the servants' quarters in the attic. Do not come out. Do not make a sound until I come for you. Do you understand?" Rose nodded frantically and bolted for the door. Arthur waited a beat, composed his face into a mask of bored indifference, and walked out into the foyer, just as the butler opened the front door. "Cousin!" Frederick's voice boomed, cheerful and smooth as oil. He strode into the hall, stripping off his gloves. He was a handsome man, with blonde hair and blue eyes that lacked the warmth they feigned. "Merry Christmas, Arthur. I heard a rumor in the club that you actually left the house last night. A miracle." Arthur descended the stairs slowly. "Frederick, to what do I owe the pleasure? I thought you were wintering in Bath." "I was," Frederick said, handing his coat to the butler. "But I heard disturbing news. My sources tell me there was an incident at the Opera House. A beggar woman? And you brought her here?" Frederick's eyes scanned the hallway, sharp and predatory. "I did," Arthur said, reaching the bottom of the stairs. He leaned against the banister, crossing his arms. "A charity case. It is Christmas, after all. Even the Ice King has to keep up appearances." Frederick laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Charity? You come now, Arthur." "Who is she really?" "Just a stray," Arthur lied smoothly. "She died in the carriage. I'm having the body prepared for burial in the pauper's grave." He watched Frederick closely. For a split second, relief washed over his cousin's face. It was subtle, a relaxation of the jaw, a lowering of the shoulders. "Oh," Frederick said, placing a hand on his chest. "What a nuisance for you. But how noble still. Are you sure it wasn't someone we knew? The description I heard. Who would it be, Frederick?" Arthur stepped closer, towering over his cousin. "Who are you afraid it is?" Frederick chuckled nervously, taking a half step back. "Afraid? Don't be absurd. It's just, well, ghosts have a way of haunting us, don't they? Speaking of ghosts, it's been 5 years almost to the day since she left." "I am aware," Arthur said coldly. "Good riddance, I say," Frederick said, regaining his composure. "She would have destroyed the family name. You're lucky I was there to help you pick up the pieces, Arthur. Remember that." "I remember everything," Arthur said. "I remember how sick I was that week, how you insisted on nursing me yourself." Frederick froze. The cane in his hand went still. "Family duty, dear cousin. Nothing more." "Right." Arthur pushed off the banister. "Well, as you can see, the house is in mourning for my charity case. I'm afraid I'm not fit company." "Of course," Frederick nodded, his eyes darting toward the stairs. "I'll leave you to your scotch. But Arthur, if you find anything personal on the woman, burn it. Best not to let the past infect the present. I will bear that in mind." Frederick turned and left. Arthur watched the heavy door close, locking the wolf out. But he knew it wouldn't hold him for long. Frederick suspected something. The lie about the death wouldn't hold up once the servants started talking in the village. Arthur turned and sprinted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He needed answers. Now. When Arthur burst into the blue room, Lydia was awake. She was sitting up against the pillows, clutching the sheets to her chest. Her eyes were wide and terrified, darting around the room as if expecting an executioner. When she saw Arthur, she let out a strangled cry and tried to scramble off the far side of the bed. "Lydia, stop!" Arthur commanded, crossing the room in 3 strides. "He's here!" she gasped, her voice raspy and broken. "I heard his voice. I heard him downstairs. You have to let me go. If he finds me here, he'll kill Rose." Arthur caught her by the arms just as she tried to stand. Her legs were too weak to support her, and she collapsed against him. He held her tight, feeling the heat of her fever burning through her thin nightgown. "He is gone," Arthur said firmly, gripping her shoulders. "I sent him away. You are safe. Rose is safe." At the mention of Rose, Lydia stopped struggling. She looked up at him, searching his face. "Rose, where is she? What have you done with her?" "She is hiding in the attic with Mrs. Gable. She is safe, Lydia. I swear it." Lydia slumped against him, sobbing dry, hacking sobs that shook her entire frame. Arthur guided her back to the bed and sat on the edge, refusing to let go of her hand. "Why, Lydia?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "Tell me the truth. No more lies. Why did you leave me? Why are you terrified of Frederick?" Lydia looked at the door, then back at Arthur. She took a shuddering breath. He found out," she whispered. "Found out what?" "About your father's will," she said. "The codicil, the one that said if you didn't marry by your 30th birthday, the control of the estate trust would pass to the next in line until an heir was produced. Frederick needed money. He had gambling debts. Massive ones. He needed control of the Ashford accounts." Arthur frowned. "I knew about the codicil. That's why we were rushing the wedding." "Yes," Lydia said, tears spilling over. "But Frederick didn't want the wedding to happen. A week before the ceremony. Do you remember getting sick? You thought it was the flu." "I remember," Arthur said darkly. "I couldn't stand up. I was hallucinating." "It wasn't the flu," Lydia said, clutching his hand so hard her knuckles turned white. "It was arsenic. I found the powder in Frederick's room when I went to look for a book. He caught me." Arthur felt the room spin. His cousin. His blood. He told me he had been dosing you for weeks," Lydia continued, the words tumbling out now. "Just enough to make you weak. Enough to make you pliable. But he said if I married you, he would finish the job. He said you would die on our wedding night, and he would make it look like heart failure." "God in heaven," Arthur whispered. "He gave me a choice," Lydia sobbed. "He said I could marry you and watch you die, or I could leave. He said I had to make you hate me. I had to make the scandal so big, so unforgivable that you would never look for me. Because if you came looking, he would kill you." "So you stole the sapphire?" "I didn't," Lydia cried. "He took it. He planted the story. He gave me £50 and put me on a train to Liverpool. He told me if I ever wrote to you, if I ever returned to London, his men would find me and finish what he started with the arsenic." Arthur stood up, pacing the room, his hands shaking with rage. It all made sense. The sudden illness, Frederick's constant presence by his bedside, the letters Lydia supposedly wrote that were filled with such cruel, uncharacteristic venom. Frederick had likely forged them. "And Rose?" Arthur asked, stopping at the foot of the bed. Lydia looked down at her lap. I didn't know I was with child until I was in Liverpool. I wanted to tell you. God, Arthur, I wanted to tell you so badly, but I couldn't risk it. If Frederick knew there was an heir, a child who stood before him in the line of succession, he would kill the baby." Arthur closed his eyes. The magnitude of her sacrifice hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't left him for another man. She hadn't left him for money. She had walked into hell to save his life. She had raised his daughter in the slums, starving herself to protect the secret, all to keep Arthur alive. He had spent 5 years hating a saint. "Why did you come back?" Arthur asked softly. "We were in Manchester," Lydia whispered. "We were safe for a while. I took in washing. But a man saw us, one of Frederick's associates. He recognized me. I saw him following Rose from school. We ran that night. We came to London because I didn't know where else to go. I thought if I could just get Rose to you and then disappear, maybe you would protect her without knowing who she was. You were going to give her to me and leave." "I am dying, Arthur," Lydia said, looking at her wasted hands. "I know I am. I just wanted her to be safe. I wanted her to be with her father. Arthur sat back down on the bed. He reached out and cupped her face. His thumb brushed over the scar on her forehead. "You are not dying," he vowed fiercely, "and you are not going anywhere. Frederick took 5 years from us. He will not take another second." "Arthur, you don't understand," Lydia pleaded. "He is powerful now. He has connections. And I am the Duke of Ashford," Arthur snarled, the Ice King resurfacing. "But this time the ice was armor, and I know his secret. He didn't count on you surviving. He didn't count on Rose." Suddenly the door handle rattled. It was locked. Arthur stood up, placing himself between the door and the bed. "Open up, Arthur." Frederick's voice came through the heavy wood, no longer cheerful. It was menacing. "I know she's in there. I saw the child, Arthur. I saw the little brat in the attic window." Lydia whimpered, pulling the covers up to her chin. Arthur walked to the fireplace and picked up the heavy iron poker. He weighed it in his hand. "Stay in bed, Lydia," Arthur said calmly. "Arthur, don't," she cried. "He'll have a pistol." "Let him try," Arthur said. He walked to the door and unlocked it. He swung the door open. Frederick stood there. He was alone, but his hand was inside his coat pocket. His face was twisted in a sneer. "You lied to me, cousin," Frederick hissed. "The little girl. She has the Pembroke eyes. You can't hide a bastard like that." "She is not a bastard," Arthur said, his voice deadly quiet. "She is my daughter, and the future Duchess." Frederick laughed, a short, sharp bark. "She's a loose end, just like her whore mother." He pulled a small revolver from his coat. "I should have used more arsenic. You were always so resilient, Arthur. It was annoying." Arthur didn't flinch. He stared down the barrel of the gun. "You won't shoot me, Frederick. Not here. Not with the servants downstairs. The noise would bring them running." "I'll say it was a tragedy," Frederick smiled, cocking the hammer. "A mad beggar woman broke in, killed the Duke, and I had to intervene. A tragic end to the Pembroke line. I'll be the hero who avenged you." "No!" Lydia screamed. She threw herself from the bed, stumbling across the room. "Lydia, get back!" Arthur roared. But Frederick's eyes flickered to the movement. That split second of distraction was all Arthur needed. He swung the iron poker with all the strength of 5 years of repressed rage. The iron poker connected with Frederick's wrist with a sickening crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Frederick screamed, a high-pitched, animalistic sound, and the revolver clattered to the floor, skittering across the Persian rug. But Frederick was desperate, and desperation made him dangerous. Ignoring his shattered wrist, he lunged at Arthur with his good arm, tackling the Duke around the waist. The two men crashed into a small writing desk, sending a crystal decanter and glasses shattering to the floor. Whiskey and shards of glass sprayed everywhere. "You fool!" Frederick spat, his face inches from Arthur's, his breath smelling of expensive brandy and rot. "You should have just died 5 years ago. You were supposed to die," Arthur roared, fueled by a decade of repressed emotion. He wasn't fighting for his title. He wasn't fighting for his money. He was fighting for the wasted years. He was fighting for the woman who had scrubbed floors to save him. Arthur drove his knee into Frederick's stomach, doubling him over. He grabbed his cousin by the lapels of his coat and slammed him against the wall, shaking the heavy oil paintings. "You took her from me!" Arthur bellowed, landing a heavy fist against Frederick's jaw. "You made my daughter live in squalor!" Frederick stumbled back, blood pouring from his lip. But his eyes darted to the floor. The gun. It was only a few feet away. Lydia, seeing his gaze, threw herself forward. She was weak, barely able to stand, but adrenaline surged through her veins. She scrambled on her hands and knees towards the weapon. "No!" Frederick shrieked. He kicked out, his heavy boot catching Lydia in the ribs. She cried out and collapsed, curling into a ball. That was the moment Arthur Pembroke lost the last shred of his civility. The Ice King shattered, revealing a volcano. He didn't just hit Frederick, he dismantled him. Arthur tackled his cousin, pinning him to the floorboards. His hands, usually so careful with ledgers and quill pens, wrapped around Frederick's throat. "I will kill you," Arthur snarled, his thumbs digging into Frederick's windpipe. "I will tear you apart with my bare hands." Frederick clawed at Arthur's face, his eyes bulging, face turning a mottled purple. The life was choking out of him, and Arthur felt nothing but a dark, grim satisfaction. "Arthur, stop!" The voice was small, terrified, and cut through the red haze of Arthur's rage like a knife. He froze. He looked up. Rose was standing in the doorway. She must have slipped past Mrs. Gable in the chaos. She was clutching a ragged doll, her eyes wide with horror, staring at her father who looked like a monster. "Don't kill him," Rose whispered, tears trembling on her lashes. Mamma says we can't be like the bad men." Arthur's grip loosened. He looked down at Frederick, who was gasping for air, clutching his throat. He looked at his own hands, shaking and white-knuckled. If he killed him now, in front of his daughter, he would be exactly what Frederick claimed he was. A brute, a killer. He would go to prison, and Rose would be an orphan again. Arthur stood up, backing away, his chest heaving. Frederick rolled onto his side, coughing violently. You haven't the stomach for it," he wheezed, managing a bloody, broken smile. "Just, that's why you'll always be weak, cousin." Suddenly the room swarmed with people. Thomas the footman, Mrs. Gable, and 2 stable hands burst in, armed with makeshift weapons. They stopped, taking in the scene. The shattered glass, the unconscious Lydia, the Duke panting with rage, and Lord Frederick bleeding on the floor. "Secure him," Arthur commanded, pointing a trembling finger at Frederick. "Tie him to the chair. If he moves, break his other arm." Thomas didn't hesitate. He and the stable hands descended on Frederick, dragging him upright. Arthur rushed to Lydia. She was lying still, clutching her side where Frederick had kicked her. "Lydia!" Arthur gathered her into his arms, ignoring the glass cutting into his knees. "Lydia, look at me." Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at Rose, standing in the doorway. "Rose," she rasped. "She is safe," Arthur promised, smoothing the hair back from her clammy forehead. "It's over, Lydia. He can't hurt us any more." "Inspector Reed," Lydia whispered, clutching Arthur's lapel. "You must call Inspector Reed at Scotland Yard. He is an honest man. Tell him about the arsenic." "I will," Arthur vowed. "I will tell the world." He looked up at Mrs. Gable, who was shielding Rose from the sight of the blood. "Send for the police," Arthur ordered, his voice returning to the icy calm of the Duke, but with a new underlying steel. "And tell Dr. Warren to return immediately. And Mrs. Gable?" "Yes, Your Grace?" "Prepare the guest suite for the police," Arthur said, looking at Frederick with cold hatred. "We are going to have a long night, and nobody leaves this house until I have a confession signed in blood. The scandal that rocked London in January of 1893 was unlike anything society had ever seen. It wasn't just a ripple, it was a tidal wave. The arrest of Lord Frederick Pembroke for attempted murder, fraud, and embezzlement dominated every newspaper from the Times to the penny dreadfuls. Inspector Edmund Reed, a man known for his meticulous nature and unbribable character, had taken the case personally. When he raided Frederick's townhouse in Belgravia, he didn't just find gambling debts. He found a veritable apothecary of poisons. He found forged letters, dozens of them, drafted in Lydia's handwriting, practicing the cruel phrases that had broken Arthur's heart 5 years ago. He also found the Pembroke sapphire. It was hidden in a hollowed-out book in Frederick's study. Lydia hadn't stolen it. Frederick had pocketed it to fund his vices and frame her in one stroke. But while the courts buzzed and the gallows were prepared for Frederick, Pembroke Manor was quiet. It had been 2 weeks since the attack. Lydia was still confined to bed. The kick to her ribs had cracked 2 of them, and combined with her pneumonia, her recovery was agonizingly slow. She slept most of the day, her body finally allowing itself to collapse after years of survival mode. Arthur spent those 2 weeks learning how to be a father. It was a clumsy, terrifying process. He, who could command the House of Lords with a single glare, found himself baffled by a 5-year-old girl. One rainy afternoon, Arthur found Rose in the library. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by towering stacks of books she couldn't read, building a castle out of them. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching her. She had his chin, she had his brow, but she had Lydia's spirit. "That is a very impressive fortification," Arthur said, stepping into the room. Rose looked up. She was no longer afraid of him, but she was still wary. She treated him like a large, unpredictable dog that might bite or might lick. "It's not a fortification," Rose corrected him. "It's a bakery. This is where we sell the bread." Arthur smiled, a rare, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He sat down on the Persian rug, heedless of his pristine trousers. "I see. And how much is a loaf of bread in this castle?" "2 hugs," Rose said seriously. "Or a penny? But we prefer hugs because pennies are heavy." Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. 2 hugs. It was a currency she likely hadn't had enough of. "Rose," Arthur began, picking up a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare and adding it to her wall. "I want to tell you something. About your mother. And about me." Rose stopped building. She looked at him with those heterochromatic eyes. "You're my papa," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Arthur nodded. "Did your mother tell you that?" "She told me my papa was a good man who got lost," Rose said. "She said he lived in a big house and was very sad because the sun went away." Arthur bowed his head. The sun went away. Even after everything he had supposedly done to her, Lydia had never poisoned her daughter's mind against him. She had painted him as a tragic figure, not a villain. "I was very sad," Arthur admitted, "and I was very lost. But I found my way back. Because of you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver vine ring, the cheap one Lydia had kept. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. "Mama's magic ring," Rose whispered. "I want to give it back to her," Arthur said. "But I think I need your help. I think we should give it to her together. When she wakes up." Rose smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through the London fog. "Okay, but you have to bring the bread." Later that evening, the doctor gave them permission to sit with Lydia. She was propped up on pillows, looking pale but lucid. The fever had finally broken. Her dark hair was braided over one shoulder, and the bruising on her face was fading to a dull yellow. When Arthur walked in, holding Rose's hand, Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "Mama!" Rose cried, running to the bed but stopping short, remembering the doctor's warning about the broken ribs. She carefully climbed up and sat near Lydia's feet. "Hello, my darling," Lydia whispered, stroking Rose's cheek. Then her gaze lifted to Arthur. The silence between them was heavy with 5 years of unsaid words. Guilt, regret, longing, and pain swirled in the air. Arthur signaled for the nurse to leave. He walked to the side of the bed and sat down on the chair that had become his permanent station. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice rough. "Like I was trampled by a horse." Lydia managed a weak smile. "But warm. I haven't been warm in a long time." Arthur took her hand. It was still rough, calloused from scrubbing floor, but he held it like it was made of spun glass. "Lydia," he began, and his voice broke. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to look her in the eye. There are no words in the English language for how sorry I am. I should have known. I should have fought harder. I shouldn't have believed the letters." "He was very clever, Arthur," Lydia said softly. "And you were sick. You were dying." "I let you suffer," Arthur insisted, self-loathing etched into his features. "I sat in this house, drinking scotch and feeling sorry for myself, while you were starving in an alleyway with my child. I am not a man. I am a failure." Lydia squeezed his hand. Her grip was weak, but firm. "Arthur, look at me." He looked up. "You saved us," she said. "When we came to you, you didn't turn us away. You didn't call the police. You picked me up out of the snow. You believed the evidence of your eyes, not the lies of the past. That is the man I fell in love with." She took a shaky breath. "We were both victims, Arthur. Frederick did this to us. Don't let him win by destroying us with guilt now that he's gone." Arthur turned her hand over and kissed the palm, closing his eyes against the sting of tears. "I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I will grovel if I have to. I will buy you the moon if you ask for it." "I don't want the moon," Lydia said. "I just want to stay here. I want Rose to grow up with a father." "She will," Arthur vowed, "and she will grow up with a mother who is treated like a queen." He nodded to Rose. Rose scrambled up, digging into her pocket. She pulled out the silver ring. "Papa says you need your magic back," Rose said, placing the ring in Lydia's palm. Lydia gasped. She looked from the cheap silver band to Arthur's hopeful, terrified face. "I will buy you a new sapphire," Arthur said quickly. "A bigger one, the biggest in London. But I thought, perhaps—" "No," Lydia cut him off. She slipped the silver ring onto her finger. It was loose now, on her thin hand, but it still fit. "I don't want a sapphire. I hate sapphires. I want this one." She looked at him, her eyes clear and shining with a love that had survived poverty, poison, and time. "Ask me again, Arthur," she whispered. Arthur slid off the chair, dropping to one knee beside the bed. It was a humble posture for a duke, but he had never felt taller. "Lydia Hawthorne," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Will you marry me? Again? Will you let me be your husband and Rose's father and promise to never, ever let you go?" Lydia smiled, and tears ran down her cheeks. "Yes, yes, Arthur. 1,000 times yes." Rose clapped her hands. "Does this mean we can have cake?" Arthur laughed, a sound that bubbled up from his chest, free and light. He stood up and leaned over, kissing Lydia, not the desperate kiss of a dying man, or the angry kiss of a betrayed lover, but the gentle, promising kiss of a man who had been given a second chance at life. "Yes, Rose," Arthur said, resting his forehead against Lydia's. "We can have all the cake you want." The storm outside battered the windows of Pembroke Manor, but inside the ice had finally melted. 1 year later, the fog over London was just as thick, but inside Pembroke Manor, the air was warm and scented with pine, beeswax, and cinnamon. It was Christmas Eve again, but the silence of the tomb had been replaced by the roar of a full-string orchestra. The grand ballroom, shuttered and dark for 6 long years, was alive with the blaze of 1,000 candles. The cream of London society had gathered, not to gossip about the Ice King, but to witness his resurrection. Lord Frederick was currently rotting in a damp cell in Newgate Prison, awaiting transportation to the penal colonies, his name forever struck from the family tree. But no one spoke of him tonight. Tonight was for the living. Arthur stood at the top of the sweeping marble staircase. He was no longer the gaunt, angry shadow who had stalked the opera house. He looked younger, the harsh granite lines around his mouth smoothed away by a year of laughter and peace. Beside him stood Lydia, radiant in deep crimson velvet, her health fully restored. On her finger, the simple silver vine ring outshone the diamond tiara resting in her dark hair, and between them, holding both their hands tight, was Lady Rose Pembroke. She wore a dress of white silk and a smile that could light up the darkest alley in London. "Are you ready, my loves?" Arthur asked, looking down at his world. "Ready?" Lydia smiled, squeezing his hand. "I want to dance," Rose declared, bouncing on her toes, "and I want the first slice of cake." As they descended the stairs, the crowd hushed, then bowed low. It wasn't a bow of obligation, but of genuine respect. They knew that love had conquered death. They knew that the Duke had walked into the snow to save a beggar, and in doing so had saved himself. Arthur led his wife to the center of the floor. As the waltz began, he pulled her close, his eyes never leaving hers. "Happy Christmas, Lydia," he whispered against her hair. "Happy Christmas, Arthur," she replied, resting her head on his chest, right over his beating heart. Outside, the snow fell softly on the streets of London, covering the scars of the past. But inside, the fire was lit, and the Duke of Ashford would never be cold again. And that is the story of Arthur and Lydia. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the things we think are betrayals are actually sacrifices made out of love. Arthur spent 5 years hardening his heart, thinking he had been wronged, when in reality, Lydia was giving up everything to keep him safe. It shows us that truth always has a way of coming to light, no matter how deep it's buried in the snow, and that karma, like Lord Frederick found out, eventually comes for everyone. But most importantly, it teaches us that it's never too late for a second chance, and that even the coldest winter can turn into a warm spring if you're brave enough to open your eyes. If you enjoyed this story of royal intrigue, heartbreak, and redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good historical romance, and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. I'll see you in the next video,